There is actually a very magical connection with the land at the point where the land meets the water. I don't know whether this is an atavistic kind of thing. It goes back to where animals crawled out of the water, but it's something that there is magical about it. It is something that is very much relates to people, and I love it.
For over 5 decades, Arthur Cotton Moore has been a visible presence locally, nationally, and internationally with his industrial Baroque designs, his rescue and repurposing of historic buildings, and his deft replenishment of federal structures like the Library of Congress. Today, they serve as a palette to an artistry and grace that has made him one of the outstanding architects of his era. For Moore, civilization as we know it always begins at the water's edge. And today, his work exists as a pioneering statement of an environmental sensibility in an age of urban transformation.
Of course, George Washington and Pierre L'Enfant, he liked to be called Peter, they both saw Washington as a great port city, and that its future would be as not only a national capital, but a very active port and access to the inner parts of the United States. The problem was, if you look at the Potomac River, it's a very winding river, 90 miles long to get from the Chesapeake Bay up to Washington. So it was actually an inconvenient port. Then also, of course, is when they started the C&O Canal, was also the time where they laid the first rails. And so the railroad went in, and it could compete, actually do much better than the C&O Canal. What happened with the waterfronts in Washington is that they became derelict. And most of the difficult and deteriorated kind of industries went down there. It was a super industrial slum. I mean, it was as bad as any place. First, there was no way that anybody could actually get to the water's edge, because it was all private industries that walled essentially Georgetown off from its waterfront. And of course, this is anti-historical because Georgetown started as a port. And the worst, of course, was the Hoffenmeyer rendering plant, where they rendered dead animals. And the smell was incredible. So it was not only a bad-looking waterfront, but it was a stinky waterfront. Well, the Kennedy Center is there mostly because it was available urban renewal land, like where we're sitting now. The Watergate's is here because it was urban renewal land. The original scheme that Stone came up with was that the Kennedy Center looked like a pregnant banjo, and it had steps down to the river. And we always say that that's why Luigi Moretti, who was the architect for the Watergate here, he said, oh, well, they like curves. And so he made a curvy bunch of buildings here at the Watergate. But the problem was, when they made it into a box, which we sometimes call the Whitman sampler, because it's just a box, and they just lined up 3 theaters, they left off the steps, and they left off any relationship with the river. All you can do is go out on the terrace and look at the river, but you can't get down to the river. You couldn't take a ferry boat up to a dock and come to the Kennedy Center. All those things I would like to see done. I'd like to see that happen. I want to see a building on a river or a project on a river has an obligation to have a relationship to the river. The developer came to me after they had done a previous scheme which had been developed essentially by a committee. And like anything the committee produces, this was a very bad camel. So that was turned down. It was called the beach whale. So the developer came to me and he said, for a very small sum, would you give it a try? And I said, absolutely, absolutely, I would give it a can. And he said, do what you want. Just get us a permit. And so I love that. So I did what I want. And the only thing I lost was that the fountain area was supposed to be a little boat basin. And but at the time it was such an important project that I felt I should still go ahead with it. First thing that was important is that we took 31st Street, which stopped at the freeway, and brought it down to the water's edge. Then we extended Thomas Jefferson Street down here, but made it a very interesting space. It's a street, but it expands and contracts in a way to kind of push you towards going to the waterfront, and established a tower here because in all the great waterfront plazas, there is a vertical element, or a tower, a lighthouse, something of that sort. So that establishes a sense of place, yet we put it offside so that you would look down Thomas Jefferson Street with a clear view. And then we wanted to open it up as a celebration of the waterfront. The boardwalk, which you walk along like this, is actually not touching the river, it's cantilevered over the river, so that you have a sense of walking in the river, experiencing the water without obviously being in the river.
Arthur Cotton Moore's projects enabled people to perceive their environment in a new particular way. Within the U.S. population, a growing segment has extremely limited access to the natural world. Waterfronts bring us down to the rivers, said Arthur Cotton Moore, and offer the possibility of human communication with nature.
It's a complete evolution that has taken place about waterfronts. People would love to be down there. They'd love to live down there. And that was absolutely a crazy idea in 1960. If you look around and look at many of these cities, they have all of a sudden woken up to the fact that this is a great resource and that people really want to make this connection to the river. Most cities, they've been built on a waterfront. They needed a water source, and what has happened over time is that their older buildings are basically also on the waterfront. So if you're trying to revitalize a downtown, you have these two resources, old buildings and a waterfront. So this, I think, is a key to saving a great deal of the older downtowns of American cities.
Architects like Arthur Cotton Moore realize that climate change will markedly alter the shape of urban infrastructures like waterfronts. This has important implications for how architects and developers and city planners develop strategies for building waterfronts that can adapt to or withstand the onset of rising tides.
You have to realize that it's a lively source. It expands and it contracts, and so you have to live with that. You have to provide for that. We're very much into sustainable design. One of those things is, of course, rising water levels that are occurring all over the world, basically, and how do we accommodate that? And there is ways to do it in a soft manner. And that is done actually on the Georgetown waterfront. There are places to collect water, to actually collect water in the park. And you need that kind of thing. You need a kind of an absorption quality. So when the river expands, as it normally will do, periodically it expands and overflows its banks and the rest of these things. You need a way to handle that. There's no question that now having a piece of waterfront or a developable piece of waterfront is now perceived as not a golden chance, but really a great chance. If you have a very special piece of land which has access to a natural body of water, you have kind of an obligation, certainly sort of a moral obligation, to work with that natural body of water, making the project a celebration of how the buildings and the city meet the river. You want it to be a celebration.